The floor is open.
First of all, of course, thank you for illuminating us in a way that I personally have really never thought of or envisioned the world the way you've shown it to us today. But I know that there will be questions and comments, so I don't want to take up the time to ask mine at the moment. So please, Parag will be glad to answer your questions.
With China's rising middle class and their ability to consume and China's ability to buy global resources, how do you think that's going to affect conflicts down the road, competition for the resources, and alliance forming?
And the question was about China's rising middle class and their growing consumption of global natural resources and how that will affect conflict in the future. Well, what we already see is that if you make a list, on one side of the page or a board of every country that we, the United States, label a rogue state or a state of concern, let's call it, say Venezuela, Cuba, Sudan, Myanmar, Uzbekistan, North Korea, Zimbabwe, and then make a list on the right side of every country that China provides economic, financial, diplomatic, military backing to. It's the same list, like every single one, even non-oil producing countries. So Zimbabwe produces no oil, but China's in there making friends. I'm not one of those arch conservative proponents of a new Cold War thesis. I don't think that is necessary, that need be an outcome, but that is a fact, what I just said. So there is already this gaming going on, and this notion that wherever there are resources in America or the West tries to isolate a country, China comes in and picks it up. We hear a lot about China in Africa these days, and that's actually been, China has been in Africa since the 1950s, but never like this. And 80% of their FDI into Africa goes to just 5 countries, major mineral and resource rich and oil, energy rich countries like Angola, Sudan, and so forth. So there is probably enough. Well, let me answer it this way. We don't really have to be competing over those resources. There are certain rare earth elements that go into microchips and cell phones that Chinese companies want to have because they want to lock up manufacturing in those sectors and have access to those. But when it comes to oil and gas, there isn't really a reason for that. The race to seal agreements with certain countries and to get their oil out of the ground actually helps keep the price of oil down, actually, because it's not that when China sticks makes a hole in the ground in Angola, that oil goes from Angola all the way to China. It doesn't. It's a global energy market, an oil market. It does, in fact, serve everyone. So to that extent, when China is going out locking up, making these resource agreements, it isn't necessarily creating competition. It might actually be alleviating it. And that's a big misperception that a lot of people have about Chinese activity. What they're really, the misstep that people make logically is to think that because these are rogue states where we're not doing business, therefore they're locking up the resources for themselves. But if we didn't have a ban on importing oil and gas produced by or traded with Iran or Sudan, we'd be participating in that market just as everyone else is. And also, getting back to geography and really macro geography, we, the United States, don't really need Middle Eastern oil. And this is one of those sort of, Tom Friedman lines about, why are we giving all this money to Arab despots and so forth. Well, we get less than 20% of our energy from the Middle East. Venezuela is actually our second largest supplier, and we have a horrible political relationship with Venezuela. So if Hugo Chavez is still selling us all this oil, really he's going to continue to. Not only that, but Brazil has become a huge energy supplier. Canada has large reserves now as well. Mexico, the Arctic resources I mentioned, and right here in the continental United States, there have been discoveries of gas, natural gas, a resource to which much of the country ought to attempt to transition. That is some call a 100-year supply. So in the Western Hemisphere alone, the United States has enough energy resources to not need Saudi Arabia. But it's a legacy position that we have there, and it's obviously a lucrative one for energy companies, and then it also helps deepen alliances. But we're not necessarily there for the oil as such anymore, or at least decreasingly so. And also West African oil, Equatorial Guinea, Angola, these are countries that have direct geographic sort of pathway to the United States. No one is blocking that supply. We are the consumer of first sort of access to them. So I think we are fine. So there's no reason for us to be competing with China anywhere for any particular oil supply anyway. China and Korea and Japan and India have become the largest consumers of Middle Eastern oil, and that flows straight out of the Persian Gulf, underneath India, across the Indian Ocean, and to Asian countries. And then Europe as well, I mentioned those North African pipelines and the pipelines from the Caspian Sea through Turkey. So the largest consuming powers in the world, China, Japan, India, the European Union and us, we can all get enough oil and gas without having to sort of fight over it or for there to be a great game for energy resources. But the tension is going to come in the politics.
One thing you haven't touched on is the role of Al-Qaeda and global terrorist networks. And I just wonder how do they fit into all these moving disorders and minds?
Sure. A lot of people ask about Islamic geopolitics. Is there an Islamic civilization? Is it a threat if it were to somehow be collectively militant? When you work on political geography as such, there isn't so much a place for a terrorist group, which is by definition a non-state, non-territorial kind of actor. But let me just say that there is no Islamic geopolitical cohesion. Right? On any given day, Morocco and Indonesia don't think or decide or do the same thing in any coordinated way. There is an organization called the Organization of the Islamic Conference, the OIC, that has about 50 members. It's as defunct an international organization as any other. It doesn't exactly create a common geopolitics either. There is no leader of the Islamic world. There's a major Sunni-Shia rift, after all, among all the other rifts that the Islamic world has. And then there's the cultural rifts. The majority of Muslim people in the world are not Arab. They're Asian in Pakistan and India and Indonesia and Malaysia and elsewhere. So there is no coherent Islam, just like there's no coherent Christianity. There is no coherent leader to an Islamic world. It certainly isn't Al-Qaeda. And so I don't really worry about Al-Qaeda as a major geopolitical threat. Al-Qaeda can trigger certain geopolitical events. An attack on 9/11 can trigger our invasion of Afghanistan, and there's certain geopolitical consequences to that. But Al-Qaeda is not a pole of power in the world. The notion of empires, as I'm trying to stress here, or territory, is a force far more powerful, infinitely more powerful, I would say.
I've heard that the birth rate in Japan is falling a lot, and there is no in-migration. And so is Japan going to be faced with the same thing as Russia?
The Japanese birth rate is definitely a bad situation for them, but there is a desperate effort to promote migration. So here's a fun fact for you. The second or third largest Japanese city in the world is Sao Paulo, Brazil. It has a huge Japanese population. China is doing everything, Japan is doing everything it can to lure back ethnic Japanese people from around the world to live and procreate in Japan. So from the Philippines to Brazil, elsewhere. It may or may not work, but they're trying to become a more immigrant-friendly country to avoid that kind of demographic demise. And this is what's interesting. You hear about Western Europe, them not liking immigrants from Turkey or the Arab world. There are countries, though, like those same Western European countries that also have low fertility rates, that desperately need those immigrants. They need to culturally, politically integrate them in various ways, but they certainly don't have much of a future without them. This is why, for most people's view of Europe, when you say Europe, you're thinking of France, Italy, Germany, and Great Britain. You cannot, in the 21st century, think of Europe that way. That is the Europe that is demographically flat. the way I think of Europe and the way I believe that people in my generation and younger think of Europe, the Europe that they've grown up in, is that borderless commonwealth, that European Union of 27 countries, borderless sort of zone, and 450 million people. If they do not think of Europe that way, that's the end of Europe, basically. So I think that it is an existential necessity to reconceive Europe from that culturally exclusive Western Latin Europe to something much bigger that is inclusive of Turks, of Slavs, and of Arabs even to some extent.
Following up on that, the European Union and Greece and countries of similar status that may be calling out for assistance, Spain, Portugal, Italy, what should the European Union do, and what will it do, and what role does Germany have in dominating what happens?
It should. Germany obviously has a very influential role in internal EU politics. Even though the Union has expanded from 12 to 27, Germany is still the largest economy and the most populous country in the EU, and the German banks, I guess, hold a lot of the current debt in Greece, and so they're playing hardball right now. But from a political standpoint, when it comes to these teetering economies like Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Spain, Greece, and so forth, it's a real test for the political unity of the EU. I think that they should be bailing these countries out. But obviously, you know, what I say in my book is that Europe doesn't dominate disciplines. So the mentality of Brussels bureaucrats is to find ways to impose great political suffering on misbehaving governments like that of Greece, and wait until the very last minute to bail them out so that they learn their lesson. For all intents and purposes, the Greek cabinet has its weekly meeting in Brussels, you know, these days, because this is Brussels' way of saying, if you want to be bailed out, you're going to start running your country like a modern economy and not in this Balkan way that you really have been running it. And it does tend to work in the long run. One of the silver linings of the financial crisis, people right now are talking about the collapse of the euro. Until this Greek situation sort of surfaced, for the last few months what people have been saying is actually the euro will probably get stronger because countries like Iceland have absolutely no choice but to join the eurozone. Who would be, you know, how can economies that small really survive in a way outside of the eurozone? So I think that the previous observation prior to the Greek crisis still holds, that this is going to reinforce the need for there to be a stronger political cohesion in the EU and more fealty, in a way, to the euro than before.
You've given us an extremely rich and sophisticated view of an endlessly complex world. I'm curious as whether you honestly believe that some of the identifiable variables, such as demography, are really going to trump the endlessly different ways in which these variables you've identified can interact, unexpected events. In other words, what going forward is really going to drive future developments, the identifiable variables or the unexpected permutations?
The unexpected always happens, but I never say that demography trumps anything. I say that, again, geopolitics 101, on day one freshman year, or sophomore year when I started learning geopolitics, it was demography, natural resources, economic, industrial foundations, political will, in national cohesion. These are the building blocks of strategy for any country. These are also broader trends that just sort of happen, and they work. They interact on their own in very chaotic ways. One doesn't trump the other as such. So when you have desertification in the Sahel belt of Africa, and you have migration pushing Kenyans further north and east, and that leads to competition there and with its surrounding countries. That is environment interacting with demography, interacting with politics, causing a serious political tension in one part of the world. That sort of thing is happening everywhere, that strange interplay. The thawing of the Siberian permafrost mixed with the Chinese migration, mixed with the economic strength of China, leads to really Chinese control over what is nominally Russian territory. So this sort of thing is happening everywhere, but one factor doesn't dominate over the others. They interact always in chaotic ways. Sir?
Yes, you mentioned Russia's internal problems and India's internal problems. I've been reading lately that China itself has some internal problems. There's been some unrest where the militaries had to be sent in to quell some domestic disturbances. Plus, I've also been reading that they've had a rapidly aging population due to the one-child policy.
Yep.
Can you speak to
Sure.
that and the long-term stability
Yep.
of the current Chinese regime?
Yep. There are 3 or 4 things that people point to when they say, look, hey, China is the story of the day, the flavor of the month, flavor of the decade, but it's got some serious problems. They say, 1, political unrest, Tibet and Xinjiang, you've got to send in troops. Very embarrassing before the Olympics last year when the Tibetans coordinated all those protests, and so forth. On that, the sad truth is, and I have a personal sort of connection to this, I've driven across Tibet and Xinjiang. It took me several months to do. It's the world's most incredible road trip. I feel very connected to the place, but the sad fact is that what the Chinese are doing there in terms of imposing their will on those territories, on those ethnically non-Han territories, Uyghurs and Tibetans are of course entirely different ethnically than Han Chinese, has been going on since the 1950s. If you sort of woke up to the Tibetan cause, 10 years ago, even 20 years ago, or even last year before the Olympics, that's decades too late. The Hanification of the region, the integration and subjugation of those territories is very well underway. If anything, it's pretty much complete. And when you see those military crackdowns there, sure, it means that there's still pockets of unrest, but sadly, the game is over for Tibet and for Xinjiang. And again, it's very sad to have to say that as someone who really has traveled there, and I deeply appreciate the culture and the heritage of it. But that is the sad reality. Second thing that people point to is the environment. China is polluting itself to death. It's asphyxiating its people. The rates of lung cancer and everything are horrible. Can they go green? Is the second big risk factor. And there's debates about this, but if you read just even the common press, you'll see that wow, China is making huge investments in alternative energy, in hydropower, nuclear power. In other words, they're trying. They're realizing this, and they still have a lot of coal, and they use a lot of coal. But maybe they'll find ways to mitigate the effects of that. But they're making huge investments in attempting to not sort of suffocate as a country, and those investments are serious. And I've been around the country and seen that and talked to people about it. And American companies and Japanese and European companies now see it as a huge market opportunity. China has all the money. They want to go green. They don't have the latest cutting edge technology, but they are building battery-powered electric cars. And probably will become the world's largest producers of those things soon. But I think that it's a race, and we don't know whether or not China will make it in the environmental sense. But God knows they're really, really trying, actually. And the third is, the third factor, which I'll get to right before the demographic one, is political stability, right? I mean, can a one-party state survive and govern 1.5 billion people in a capitalist system? Hasn't exactly been done before, certainly not for a long period of time. And yet, the Chinese Communist Party is undeniably stronger than it's ever been before. It has its capacity, its power, its ability to rule, to reach out around the country and co-opt the economic power centers, the mayors, the companies, is stronger than ever before. The internal cohesion of the party, which was greatly at risk during the Tiananmen crisis 20 years ago, has now been restored. There's a certain internal, people actually call it democracy. They have real coalitions and factions within the Chinese Communist Party. So you have much more consensual succession and things like this. So the Communist Party of China is stable, like it or not. You hear about the 80,000 protests that happen in China every year. Those are very largely, almost exclusively, very legitimate protests against local corruption. They're not movements against the stability of the state. Those Chinese that are old enough, which is a growing number of them, I'll get to that in 1 second, remember the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward. No Chinese person wants to have another convulsive event like the Cultural Revolution or the Great Leap Forward. No way. They would rather have stability under the Communist Party than have a repeat of that. Because there we're talking about 20, 30 million people who died, and it would be nothing like that. No one in China wants anything like that. And then, so the fourth element is demographic stability. Can they grow rich before they grow old, as some people say? Here the answer is very interesting. They are, obviously income levels are very skewed in China. It's one of the most unequal countries in the world. But that's to be expected given that they began their modernization in the coastal areas and only slowly let things trickle into the agricultural and rural areas. But I think that the trends are that by building the infrastructures they have and getting more and more local roads built and connecting these internal areas, you can slowly get healthcare and medical care out to them. They have a program. They want to have a medical clinic in every village in China by the year 2015 or something like that, and they're kind of well on their way towards that. So trying to care for the population, in other words, as much as they can in a system where clearly there's no national health insurance or anything like that. So they're getting to that, but then there's the question of, do you have enough working age people to support an elderly population? The interesting twist to it is again, it relates to the role of the sort of periphery. What China does with its surplus population is, one, it exports a lot of it. I mentioned the nannies, but it's also military and soldiers and troops sort of all over the country and abroad as peacekeepers and covert military personnel and oil workers in Algeria and everywhere. So China exports people. It also has this gender imbalance. So what they're doing is importing women. The one-child policy wasn't just a one-child policy, it was a one-boy policy, wasn't it? And so they're importing women. Women from Korea, North Korea, women from Myanmar, women from Vietnam, and you're getting like this sort of hybridized Chinese kind of race. The numbers aren't huge, but it's underway. So the Chinese are aware of this, and they're undertaking some pretty clever and not unconventional ways of attempting to deal with it. But I don't think that political stability is at risk as a result of having an aging population that may not entirely be cared for by a national welfare system, let's put it that way. I think that there's a lot of local self-sufficiency in China. There's a high savings rate, as you know, which means that family members can ultimately care for the elderly and so forth. And I think that through a variety of means, I think they'll probably survive that sort of curveball as well. There's the next version of this, which I'm having developed right now. This is a software that I don't know how to use, but I give instructions to the company and they do it for me. Is about the U.S. and I couldn't help but have them do what you saw, what I did for India and Nepal with the Maoist groups. Well, the U.S.-Mexican border. There have been more deaths on the U.S.-Mexican border in the last 10 years or 5 years in gun and drug-related violence than you have had in Afghanistan. That's another, bizarre fact, but also true. We've had several thousand combat deaths or total in Afghanistan, something like 10 or more thousand deaths across the U.S.-Mexican border. So couldn't help but point to that. But we are demographically very healthy, as many people have pointed out, in terms of distribution. I think, again, I mentioned in response to the question about natural resources, we have resources north and south. And within. So our ability to fuel the economy is in good shape. Building the economy in terms of infrastructure and so forth is obviously crucial, and that's a big part of President Obama's sort of agenda. But we're very lucky still geographically, right? We're protected in a way from so much of 9/11 was in Pearl Harbor, those rare exceptions to what is otherwise a very blessed kind of geographic state. So I mean, I don't know how else to answer the question, but we're lucky.
Do you think though that we are militarily overstretched and that we should seek ways to responsibly and gradually reduce some of our protective commitments to perhaps the East Asia, perhaps even Europe, to let a new world order settle itself?
The answer is yes. I absolutely think we should be reducing military commitments, if not least because the world has changed and a lot of other places can take care of themselves and have their own military resources, not least provided by us, and almost want us to back off so that they can do that. And sometimes in some places we are considered the destabilizing factor rather than being the stabilizing one. That's just depends on where you are. In a lot of places they still want us there. There are certainly Persian Gulf countries like Qatar and Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates, which I sometimes call the 51st, 52nd, and 53rd states. God knows they want us there because they're sandwiched between Saudi Arabia and Iran and don't have very good relations either way. But the reason there's such a big debate about, are we overstretched is because there's two definitions of it. One is the financial, and because our share of military spending to GDP is very low by historical standards, never more than 2.5%, 3%. People say, oh, that's nothing. We can afford that. In fact, we can. It's certainly part of our astronomical debt and deficit. The second metric which one uses to measure that is, of course, just troop health and distribution around the world. The current quadrennial defense review, which is just being issued now, has moved away from what was called the two major theater war concept, where we could fight two major wars in two different parts of the world at the same time. We're moving away from that not only because we don't necessarily anticipate that that's the way the world is going to be, with major wars and occupations in two different places at the same time, but also because we just don't see how we could sustain it logistically and with the number of troops we have. A lot of you have heard about how the back of the military is broken, people say. There's just the constant troop rotations have been very, very taxing and straining. And that alone is reason to reduce some of our commitments and focus really on what matters. So yes, I would say we should do that.
Parag, I wonder where is autocracy necessary in this kind of world? Are things like human rights and democracy disruptive and causing instability, not working?
Mm-hmm. Depends on where. It's amazing if you travel in East Asia and you think about this notion of Asian values and the confidence that countries like China and Singapore and Vietnam have. The fastest growing countries in East Asia, the best performing economies, the most stable countries, the countries that other countries want to be like, are not the democracies. No one wants to be like Thailand. There have been 3 coups in the last 6 years. No one wants to be like Indonesia. It's a democracy, but it's this fractured, poor, fragmented sort of country. But Vietnam, sure. Singapore, absolutely. Everyone likes Lee Kuan Yew. And China, of course. There's a reason why even George Soros praises the China model. So, is democracy all that appealing between China and Russia? Although Russia is hardly anyone's role model, but China alone sustains the competitive ideal that exists today, the competitive dynamic between democracy and authoritarian capitalism. The key for most people is economic success, and you don't need democracy for that. China obviously proves that. So it's not a global clash of ideology. It's going to be a mix of the two. State capitalism is certainly going to be stronger for the countries that have the wherewithal to pursue it, like the Saudi Arabias and the Gulf countries and so forth. But there isn't going to be one answer. But I don't think that it's a new fault line. I think that it's each country is just going to pick and choose, whatever is best for itself.
Well,
one more?
Sure.
Just going way back, when you were talking about India, and you mentioned the Maoist insurrections in India, but you said it really wasn't an independence movement. What are the issues there, and why are they trying to destabilize the regime?
Well, they're not trying to destabilize. See, it's not an independence movement, therefore they're not trying to destabilize the central government of India, but they are trying to win local control over their own affairs in the country. These are often either illicit trading sorts of outfits. They're certainly ideological to some extent. Not that they're anti-India, but perhaps anti-democracy and so forth. But they're very localized sorts of insurgencies. But there are many of them. in the same country, and they're often disconnected from each other. They may have a common ideological heritage in the Maoist situation in Nepal, mixed with the tribal situation in India, but India has several thousand different tribes, so these things are just sort of spreading. And the real fundamental issue is again, very bread and butter. I mean, the fact that the eastern India is the poorest part of the country. It has experienced none of what, when you read about brand India and India shining and India, this IT superpower with Bangalore and lots of call centers, none of that is in eastern India. I mean, not a single one, other than in Calcutta, which is obviously a huge city, has IBM and other companies there, but the rest of eastern India is very depraved. And so it's what you would expect to find anywhere in the world, where you have absolutely no material benefit to the population from the economic growth that the rest of the country has experienced. One more.
I've got a question. You mentioned the three centers of Europe, China, and the United States. Do you think the linchpin there for me is Europe, though, with the new Lisbon Treaty and the political structure set up there? Do you ever think that they'll politically be able to compete with the China and the United States? Will they be like the weak leg?
Europe?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the idea of public-private collusion in the economy, the sort of neo-mercantile state capitalism, that's a European idea. Europe does it better than anyone. That's what Airbus is all about, after all, and why they get the big airplane deals. And so we're more likely to start acting like them than them like us. And not least because China does it. So again, public-private collusion, state capitalism, that is a very European thing. And now it's a Chinese thing. We were the ones who weren't doing it in the name of free market, laissez-faire capitalism. No one believes in that anymore, not even us. So if anything, we're likely to start doing that. And that's what Buy American is all about. And I think that's the future. It's countries realizing that they need to combine their public and private resources to get ahead in this hyper-competitive sort of economy. Thank you. Thanks very much.